It slipped out between yellowed pages, quiet as breath. An old photograph, soft-edged, with a crease running through the middle like a fault line in time. I was in my mother's attic, barefoot on the wooden floor that still creaked in the same places, sorting through what she left behind when I found it. We were sitting by the lake that last summer before everything changed, my hair tangled by the wind, your shoulder almost touching mine, and that smile you only ever wore when no one was watching. I hadn't thought of you in years. Or maybe I had, quietly, in the way you remember a scent when a song comes on. And yet, holding that photo, I felt 17 again, on the verge of something we never dared to name. Tell me, do you ever wonder if we missed something not because we didn't feel it, but because we didn't know what to call it? Hartwell is the kind of town that smells like warm grass and old stories in the summer, where the breeze carries, the hum of cicadas and the occasional laughter from the dock. Nothing much changes there. Not really. The bakery still sells peach pie on Fridays. The same songs play on the local radio. And everyone remembers your name, even if you haven't come home in 20 years. Elena Walsh hadn't meant to stay long. She came back because her mother had passed, and someone needed to clear out the house before it sold. A woman of 41, with careful eyes and a quiet way of folding grief into motion, she had built a life elsewhere. One with walls lined by books and mornings timed to a silent coffee routine. She had married once, divorced later, and raised a son now old enough to prefer his father's apartment in the city for the summer. But Hartwell is where she first became herself, where she once wore a vintage red dress just because it caught the light, and where she first heard someone say she looked beautiful when she laughed. That someone was Leo Brennan, her neighbor, her best friend, the boy who fixed her bike and stayed behind when everyone else left. He never said he loved her. She never asked him to. Leo still lives there, still repairs bicycles in the same garage his father once owned. He never married. He walks with a quiet patience that comes from knowing the rhythm of a place, and from years of waiting for something that never returned. He used to call her Lenny. No one else ever did. Now, as Elena walks through her childhood home, brushing dust off the windowsills and memories off her shoulders, she feels something she can't quite name. It isn't sadness, not exactly. It's the ache of what almost was, wrapped in the strange comfort of being remembered in a place she thought had forgotten her. Have you ever returned to a place that held more of you than you realized? The house was quieter than she remembered. Not just because her mother was gone, but because the silence seemed heavier now, more purposeful, as if the walls had been holding their breath, waiting for her to return. Elena moved from room to room like a guest who knew too much, brushing her fingers against familiar door frames, noticing which light switches still stuck, and which floorboards still creaked beneath her weight. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. She'd flown in the morning after the funeral, promising herself this would be quick, a week, maybe 2. Sort the things that needed sorting, sign what needed signing, and leave. Closure was such a clean word, but grief rarely behaved. It lingered in tea-stained mugs and folded quilts and post-it notes still stuck to the fridge with reminders like, buy peaches and call Lenny. She hadn't been Lenny in years. It was in the attic that she found it. An old tin box tucked beneath a fraying quilt her grandmother had once made, the edges of its lid rusted with time, the latch still stiff like it hadn't been opened in decades. She almost didn't open it. It looked too personal, too forgotten to belong to her anymore. But something, maybe the sound of the lake outside or the way the late afternoon sun hit the dust in the air, urged her hands forward. Inside were things that didn't belong anywhere else. Old concert ticket stubs, friendship bracelets, a dried daisy pressed between pages of a high school yearbook. But beneath those, folded twice and yellowed around the edges, was a letter, addressed in her own handwriting. To Leo, it said. No last name, just him. Her breath caught, not because she remembered writing it, but because she didn't. She knew the ink. She recognized the loop of her L's and the way she crossed her T's with a gentle slant, but the memory of writing it was nowhere. Slowly, like unwrapping something delicate, she opened the letter. And there it was, her voice at 18, full of stumbles and hesitations, writing the words she never said out loud. It began simply, "I don't know if I'll ever send this." The kind of opening that held both fear and longing, a classic signature of someone still learning to name their heart. The words tumbled in uneven lines, full of pauses, scratch-outs, and small apologies. She'd written it that last summer before leaving for college, a time when the world was too big and she was too small, and the thought of losing something, anything, felt like a crack in the sky. She told him about the afternoons at the lake, when he'd race her on bikes and let her win, and how she knew he did but never said thank you because it made her feel strong. She wrote about the way he said her name when she was angry, softly, like an anchor thrown in shallow water, and how she once caught herself staring at his hands while he repaired the chain on her bike. She mentioned the night they sat under, the willow tree, when the air smelled like grass and rain, and he almost told her something. She didn't know what it was, but she remembered holding her breath, just in case it changed everything. And then she wrote the most fragile line of, "If there's no one else for either of us someday, maybe we'll come back here and figure out what this almost was." Elena let the letter fall into her lap. She hadn't cried at the funeral, hadn't even cried on the plane, but now something warm and inevitable filled her throat. She wiped at her cheek before the tear even finished falling, as if catching it midair would keep the emotion from fully arriving. But it was too late. It had already settled, not just in her chest, but in the quiet certainty that maybe, back then, she had loved him in the only way she knew how, by pretending not to. She reached back into the tin box, somehow knowing there was more. And there it was, tucked beneath the envelope, a photo no larger than a postcard. It was slightly faded, the ink smudged, but she would have known that moment anywhere. They were both sitting beneath the willow behind his house, legs stretched. Out, the lake behind them turned gold with the late August sun. She was laughing, mouth wide, head tilted back, and Leo was looking at her, not the camera. His hand rested beside hers, their pinkies almost touching, and though the photographer had probably meant to capture a casual summer afternoon, what it had really caught was something else. Something suspended. Something almost. On the back, in her handwriting again, barely legible now, were the words, "The day before goodbye." She closed the box slowly, as though sealing something sacred. The attic was still. Outside, a bird chirped once, then stopped. Elena held the photo and the letter, unsure if she was meant to feel regret or gratitude, or whether the two had always been the same when it came to him. Maybe she had been too young. Maybe he had been too afraid. Or maybe neither of them had known that almost could follow you longer than certainty ever could. She stood and carried the box downstairs, her fingers still wrapped around the past like a secret only now ready to be remembered. The sky was that soft gray-blue Hartwell knew so well, clouded but not heavy, like it might rain in the evening but was content to wait. Elena hadn't meant to stop. She was only out to pick up batteries and a box of dish soap, to do something. Mindless, something that wouldn't make her think of attics and tin boxes and the weight of her own handwriting. The general store had moved since she last lived here, but the bike shop, Brennan's, was still exactly where it had always been, between the hardware store and the florist with the faded hydrangeas in the window. She paused outside, uncertain why she had stopped. The door was cracked open, just enough to hear the low hum of a radio, some folk song from decades ago, and the sound of metal gently clinking against metal. She might have walked on. She almost did. But then a small, irrational part of her wondered if the boy who used to fix her brakes and race her down the lakeside trail might still be there, hunched over a rusted chain or a stubborn bolt. She stepped in. It smelled exactly the same. Grease and sawdust and the faint scent of old rubber tires. The light came in through high windows, casting long slices of gold onto the floor. A man stood near the back, bent over a bike frame, hands steady, hair touched with gray but familiar, in the way some things never quite stop belonging to memory. He turned at the sound of the bell. For a second, there was no recognition. Then his eyes widened, not with surprise, but something quieter. Like seeing a book you used to love as a child appear suddenly on a stranger's shelf. "Lenny?" he said. No one else ever called her that. She tried to smile, but it landed somewhere, shy of steady. "Hi, Leo." He didn't move, not immediately. Just stared, as if he wasn't sure if he was awake, and then slowly wiped his hands on a faded towel hanging from his belt. He looked older, of course, but the kind of older that looked earned, not diminished. His eyes were still that same shade of tired summer sky. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "My mom," she said, and he nodded without needing more. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The space between them buzzed with words that had lived too long unsaid. She should have left after that. She could have said it was nice to see him and stepped back into the sidewalk and the ordinary afternoon she had promised herself. But before she could turn, he walked to a small drawer near the counter, rummaged, and pulled something out. Without a word, he reached for her hand and dropped something into her palm. A bracelet, worn, frayed, the kind made of leather and metal beads, sun-bleached now, one end looped where the clasp had long rusted shut. "You dropped it," he said quietly. "Summer of '98, behind the shed. I found it the next day." She looked at the bracelet in her hand, unable to recall dropping it, but remembering suddenly the exact day he meant. The night of the town fair, when they'd snuck behind the food trucks to watch fireworks from the hill. He had told her something then, half a joke, half a confession. She'd laughed, unsure what to do with the way her heart had fluttered. "I didn't think you'd keep it," she said. "I didn't think I would either," he replied. "But I couldn't throw it out." She turned the bracelet over in her palm, her thumb running gently across the worn leather, as if touching it might restore something she hadn't realized had been missing. It was strange, she thought, how something so small could hold an entire season, maybe an entire person. She looked up to find Leo watching her, not the way people do when they wait for a reaction, but with the soft patience of someone who has already made peace with every possible answer. "You used to wear it all the time," he said quietly. "You said it made you feel like you belonged somewhere." "I don't remember that," she whispered, almost ashamed. "I do." Silence folded itself between them again, but it wasn't awkward. It was familiar, like the kind of quiet you share with someone who once knew what made you cry and what made you brave. She had so many things to say. "Thank you, I missed you. I'm sorry for never writing, for leaving without a real goodbye." But none of the words would shape themselves into something she trusted her voice with. So instead, she asked, "Why'd you keep it?" Leo looked down, then back at her, and the corners of his mouth pulled into a half smile. Not the kind he gave strangers or neighbors in passing, but the one that used to belong only to her. The one he wore when he was about to say something too honest. "Because," he said, "you were the only one who ever made this place feel like it meant something." She didn't know what to do with that. The version of herself she carried these days, the one who checked expiration dates, left texts unread, and folded pain neatly into piles that no one could see, had not been prepared to hear words like that. Not here. Not from him. "You called me that once," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "You probably don't remember." "Called you what?" "Home." She met his eyes fully now, not blinking. "You said I felt like home. Then summer ended, and you didn't come by again." Leo didn't answer right away. He shifted his weight slightly, leaned back against the workbench as if the words had knocked the wind out of him, or maybe just stirred something too carefully buried. "I did come by," he said finally, 3 times. "But your lights were off, and I thought, maybe you'd already left." A breath caught in her throat. All these years she'd believed he'd forgotten, that what they had, whatever it was, had been hers alone to miss. "Maybe I had," she said, "even if I didn't know it yet." Then it came. Soft, almost like a memory brushing against her skin more than a voice in the air. "You used to call me home, Leo. And then you never came back." And just like that, the moment slowed. His eyes flickered, not with regret, but recognition, of a truth neither had spoken, not then, not in the decades that followed. The next day, she didn't mean to pass the shop again. And yet, somehow, her walk toward the post office curved in that direction, and her steps slowed without asking her permission. The door was open again, music playing low, something older than either of them, and Leo was inside, bent over another frame, a towel slung over his shoulder like it had been 20 years ago. He looked up. Didn't smile this time, just nodded, a quiet sort of acknowledgement that said, "You're still here." She nodded back, walked on. Later that afternoon, at the cafe by the lake, the one with the blue awning and chairs that still scraped the same, against the tile floor, she sat with a cup of black coffee, staring at the ripples in the water. A familiar figure passed the window. He didn't stop, but he looked. Their eyes met, just for a second, and it was enough to stir something inside. Her! Not quite butterflies. More like recognition, a warmth she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. That night, back at the house, Elena opened the hallway closet and found her old summer clothes packed in a bag labeled "Lenny Keep," written in her mother's messy cursive. Inside was a dress, red, vintage cut, a little wrinkled from years of not being worn, but still intact. She had loved that dress once, not because of how it looked, but because of what it made her feel. Visible, noticed, 17 and invincible. She held it up to herself in the hallway mirror and laughed softly. The neckline was lower than she remembered, the waist tighter, but she put it on anyway, just to see. And just like that, she was back in that summer, the one that lived in flashes and songs and things never said. The fairgrounds, the smell of cotton candy and wet grass, the heat lightning in the distance. Leo brushing against her arm and then pulling away too fast, like he was afraid the moment might ask too much of him. She remembered one night in particular. The rain had come suddenly, heavy and warm. They had run, laughing, soaked to the skin, and taken cover beneath the pavilion by the lake. The silence between them had stretched that evening, long and almost too full. She remembered him looking at her, hand close enough to touch her cheek, and then not moving, choosing stillness over certainty. And she had let him. Back then, they were both better at silence than at bravery. The following morning, Elena found herself at the farmer's market. It was something her mother used to love. Saturday baskets filled with tomatoes still warm. From the vine, lavender bundled in twine, the same old couple selling honey in bear-shaped jars. She hadn't planned to stay long. But as she browsed a stand of summer peaches, a familiar voice called out behind her. "You still pick the ones with bruises." She turned. Leo stood there with 2 canvas bags and the same crooked smile he used to wear when teasing her at age 17. He held up a peach as if offering proof. "You said they taste better, less proud." She laughed, not politely, but the kind of laugh that came from remembering who she was when someone once believed in her for no reason at all. "They do," she said. Still. They walked together for a while, not saying much. The sun was climbing, warm but gentle. and Hartwell seemed to slow its breath just a little when they passed by. People waved. One woman selling pies whispered something about those two behind a display of cherry crumble. Elena pretended not to hear. Leo didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did, and chose not to say anything. Afterward, they sat under the sycamore tree by the lake, the same spot they used to meet on lazy July afternoons. He offered her half his sandwich, turkey, mustard, no mayo. She remembered. He always hated mayo. The breeze picked up, ruffling the hem of her dress. Not the red one, not yet. Today it was just denim and cotton, easy and forgettable. But the way Leo looked at her, she wondered if he noticed anyway. Not the clothes, just her. They spoke about neutral things, the bakery changing hands, how the winters had been harsher lately, the fact that his niece now worked at the library. But in the pauses, those soft spaces between sentences, they both heard something else, a rhythm they used to know. The quiet certainty that this wasn't a coincidence. Not entirely, and yet, neither reached for it. Elena found herself watching his hands again, the way his fingers curved around his water bottle, the way he tugged at a loose thread on his sleeve, the way he never looked directly at her for more than a few seconds at a time. It was comforting, in a strange way. Familiar. Like rereading a book you once knew by heart, but hadn't opened in years. That night, back at her mother's house, she laid the red dress across her bed, smoothed out, the wrinkles with her palm. She wasn't sure if she wanted to wear it for him, or for the version of herself she had forgotten she used to be. On the third afternoon, she wore the red dress. Not to impress him, not to make a statement. She wore it because the wind was soft, because the house was too quiet, and because some part of her wanted to remember what it felt like to take up space without apologizing. She brushed her hair, longer now, more silver at the temples, and didn't reach for makeup. If he remembered her, she wanted him to remember the truth of her, not the polished version she had learned to wear in city mirrors. The dress still fit, just barely. It hugged her in different places now, fell looser in others. The zipper caught, halfway, and she laughed aloud in the empty room as she struggled with it, surprised by the sound of her own voice. She didn't text him, didn't tell him where she was going. She simply walked to the cafe by the lake and sat in the same chair she'd sat in a dozen times before, back straight, chin lifted slightly toward the light. Leo arrived 20 minutes later. She didn't know how he knew, whether by habit or hope. But he walked through the door like someone chasing a familiar echo. And then he saw her. He paused. Not obviously, not rudely, just long enough for his eyes to land on her, for something, behind them to shift, like a memory being stirred from the bottom of a long-forgotten drawer. His expression didn't change much, but his shoulders squared. His pace slowed. He didn't say anything about the dress. He sat down, asked if she'd tried the peach cobbler, said the coffee was too bitter this week, spoke of rain coming tomorrow, maybe the next. She nodded, agreed, listened, responded, but inside her, something wilted. She had worn the dress for herself, yes, but also in some buried place, she had hoped it would spark something in him. A flicker, a pause longer than polite, a moment where memory overtakes routine. But instead, there was only coffee and weather and careful conversation. She stirred her cup slowly, the ceramic clinking soft against the spoon. "Do you remember this dress?" she asked, keeping her voice even. He blinked, looked again. Yeah, he said after a beat too long. "I think I do. You wore it to the summer fair." "And?" He smiled faintly. "It looked nice then. It still does." A quiet fell between them, not the kind that binds, but the kind that reveals. And in that pause, Elena realized something she hadn't dared admit. Sometimes, the people who once saw you completely stop looking. Not out of cruelty, just out of time. That night, back at her mother's house, Elena sat alone on the porch steps. The red dress was folded neatly on her lap, no longer worn, but held with a strange tenderness, as if it were not just fabric, but memory made tangible. The street was quiet, lamplight stretching across the empty road like long arms reaching for something long gone. Crickets chirped in the weeds. The wind moved through the branches in slow, sweeping sighs. She thought about the way Leo had smiled. Kind, yes. Familiar, yes. But distant in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't that he didn't care. She believed he did. But care wasn't always enough. And love, whatever version they might have brushed against all those years ago, didn't always know how to survive in the spaces where nothing was said. She looked down at her hands. They were older now, not the hands that once gripped handlebars and dared him to race. These were hands that had signed divorce papers, hands that had cradled a fevered child, hands that had learned how to make coffee one-handed while typing, emails with the other. And yet tonight they trembled just a little, not from sadness, but from the realization that what she had come here for wasn't him. She had come back to remember who she had been when she still believed the world would pause for a moment like a kiss waiting to happen. She had come back to see if something remained, something soft and true, beneath the layers. Of roles and years and letting go, Leo was part of that memory, undeniably. But he was no longer the center of it. She pressed the dress to her chest for a moment, then stood and walked back inside. In the hallway mirror, she caught her reflection and paused. For once, she didn't flinch, didn't adjust, just looked. And in the stillness of her gaze, she saw not a woman waiting to be remembered, but one slowly, gently remembering herself. Upstairs, she pulled the letter from the tin box once more, read the lines she had written at 18, marveled at how tenderly she had hoped. Then, for the first time, she picked up a pen, not to rewrite, not to edit, but to respond. She didn't know what she would say yet, but she knew it would be hers. It was a Tuesday morning when Elena found herself standing outside the Hartwell Public Library, the building smaller than she remembered, but the brick just as red, the air just as heavy with quiet. She hadn't been here in over 2 decades, yet the door still gave the same little squeak as she pushed it open, and the smell, books and dust and something vaguely floral, hit her with an ache she couldn't name. She was there for paperwork. The deed, to the house, some tax documents and a zoning form she didn't quite understand but had been told she needed. The clerk behind the desk was a young woman, cheerful and helpful, who handed her a clipboard and pointed toward the back reading room where she could sit and fill it all out. Elena walked slowly past the shelves, trailing her fingers along the spines without meaning to. Titles she hadn't thought of in years looked up at her like old friends, their faded jackets worn thin by time and touch. She passed the fiction section, the reference wall, and then, in a corner by the window, saw the table. It was round, scratched, in places. The same place she and Leo used to sit after school, pretending to study while slipping notes across spiral notebooks. A wave of something warm and sore rolled through her chest. She sat. As she spread out her documents, something beneath the table caught her eye. A small leather-bound notebook, tucked barely beneath the edge of the window ledge. She reached for it. The leather was worn soft, the edges curled slightly, and there was no name on the cover. But when she opened it, she recognized the handwriting instantly. Leo. His scrawl was unmistakable. Messy but deliberate, letters leaning forward like they were always chasing something. The first few pages were lists, bike parts, maybe grocery notes. But then, about halfway through, she turned a page and froze. At the top, written in capital, letters, for Lenny, 2004. Her breath caught in her throat. She glanced around the room as if someone might see her holding something too private, too sacred. But the room was empty. Only her. And the echo of his voice, trapped in ink and time. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the page. The ink had faded just enough to suggest it had been written in a moment of urgency, or maybe late at night, when the weight of everything unspoken became too heavy to carry in silence. At the top, written in Leo's unmistakable hand, Lenny. I never thought I'd write this. Or maybe I did. Maybe I've been writing it in my head since the day you left. She sat back, the notebook resting gently against her knee, and let her eyes fall line by line, each word pulling her deeper into a version of him she had never known, or perhaps never dared to know. I told myself I was being noble, that you had bigger things waiting, that you'd never really belong to this town or to someone like me. But the truth is, I was afraid. You looked at me that summer like I was someone, and I didn't know what to do with that. I thought if I waited, you might come back, and if you didn't, I could pretend it meant nothing. But it wasn't nothing. You weren't nothing. Elena swallowed hard. The room around her seemed to dissolve into silence. Even the sound of distant pages turning faded, as though the library itself understood this moment wasn't meant to be interrupted. In 2002, I passed through Chicago. I thought about finding you. I had your parents' old address. I even walked past the building once. But I didn't go in. I told myself you'd moved on, that I would only complicate things. The truth, though? I wanted to knock. I wanted to ask if you remembered that night at the lake. If you ever replayed it like I did, your hair stuck to your cheek, the way you laughed at the fireflies, the way I almost touched your face and then didn't. God, I regret that moment more than anything. Her eyes blurred. She blinked quickly, not wanting to miss a single word. She turned the page and read the line that made her entire chest still. I thought, if you ever came back, maybe then I'd be brave. Maybe then I'd say it. But you never came back. She closed the notebook for a breath, needing space, needing time, but unable to stop herself from opening it again almost instantly. Because there was more. There had to be more. Something inside her knew that these words had waited too long in the dark to be left unread. Elena's fingers curled tightly around the edges of the notebook now, her thumb unconsciously brushing along the crease of the spine as she turned the next page. The light from the library window fell across the paper like morning sunlight on an old kitchen table, familiar, warm, and slightly aching. I kept thinking about that bracelet. The next lines read, I never meant to hold on to it this long. I kept it in a drawer, then a box, then moved it to the shop like it might anchor something that had already drifted too far. She smiled softly, the memory of it still fresh from only days ago. She could feel the weight of that bracelet again in her palm. How warm it had been from his hands. How quietly he had said, You dropped it. But it wasn't the bracelet that undid her. It was what followed. You were never the girl I forgot. You were the one I remembered in pieces. You were the name I never deleted from my phone. The smell of rain before it arrived. The first song on a playlist I never played past track 2. Her breath hitched. She stared at that line for a long time, feeling each word ripple through her like something ancient being disturbed. And then there it was, the line that stopped everything. If you ever came back, Lenny, just once, I swear, I wouldn't let you go again. I'd tell you everything. I'd stay. She read it again, and again, her lips parted but no sound came. She reached up to her chest, not even realizing her hand had moved, as if trying to keep something inside from shattering or spilling or both. This wasn't just a confession. It wasn't even an apology. It was a map, drawn too late, left in a drawer too long, but somehow still pointing back to the same place. A place called Almost. And then came the final line. Soft, unfinished, like it had been written in a rush, and never returned to. Just come back once, that's all I ever needed. Just once. Elena sat still for a long time after she finished reading, the notebook resting open on her knees, Leo's words still blooming softly in her chest like a bruise that didn't hurt, but ached. The silence around her had grown denser somehow, not oppressive, but full, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, unwilling to intrude upon the quiet unraveling happening inside her. She didn't cry. That surprised her. She had thought she might, had braced for it even. But the tears didn't come. What came instead was a steadiness, a gentle, pulsing awareness that something inside her had shifted, not shattered, just shifted. Like a boat that had finally turned toward the current it had been fighting for years. She looked down at the notebook again and closed it carefully, as if tucking something precious back where it had waited too long to be seen. She held it for a moment longer, her hands cupping its weight, knowing full well she was holding more than paper. She was holding a version of Leo she had never known, a boy who had waited, a man who had written, and somehow, through all the years and silences, never quite let her go. What do you do with a truth that arrives late? She stood slowly, her knees stiff from sitting too long. The window beside her let in a wash of light now, the kind that comes just before the sky changes, before the day shifts. She slid the notebook back where she found it, beneath the ledge, though she hesitated for a second too long. Her fingers lingered on the leather cover. Part of her wanted to take it. Part of her wanted to write back. Instead, she stepped away. As she walked past the shelves and toward the front desk, she didn't rush. Her pace was steady, her breath even, but her heart moved differently now. Not faster, not louder, just truer. Outside, the wind had picked up. Leaves rustled across the sidewalk like whispers escaping from the past. She stood there for a while, looking down the street that led back to the house, back to the porch where she'd once worn a red dress, back to the shop where Leo still fixed bikes and left notebooks behind like confessions folded shut. She had come looking for documents. She had found something else. And though she walked away with nothing in her hands, she knew, absolutely, that she wasn't leaving empty. The rain came the next day. Not a storm, not a summer downpour like when they were 17, but a gentle, unrelenting drizzle that soaked into the wooden porch and made the windows hum with quiet. Elena sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a lukewarm mug of tea she'd already reheated twice. She hadn't spoken to Leo since the day at the cafe. She hadn't gone back to the library either. The notebook, though hidden, felt ever present, like a thread gently wrapped around her ribs, tugging with each breath. She watched the rain paint long lines across the glass, her reflection faint behind the water, blurred, like a memory not quite gone but no longer clear. The house, with all its creaks and familiar shadows, felt more silent than usual. Not empty exactly, just no longer waiting. She thought of that line in his letter. If you ever came back, and how she had, quietly, unannounced, like someone returning to a place they didn't expect to still exist. But she hadn't knocked on his door. She hadn't said, I read it. I know now. She hadn't even asked, is it still true? And that perhaps was the quietest kind of loss, when the moment presents itself, soft and trembling in the palm of your hand, and you let it go because you don't know what to do with something that fragile. Later that afternoon, she wandered through the rooms again. The guest room still smelled like cedar. The hallway still had the slight dip where she used to leap over imaginary lava as a child. Her mother's bedroom remained untouched, but it was the attic she returned to, standing in the doorway, fingers, curled around the frame as if needing its presence to steady her. The box was still there. The photograph still tucked inside. The version of her with laughter in her eyes, and a boy beside her who hadn't yet learned how to speak his heart. She sat on the floor and let the photo rest against her knees. What would it have taken, truly, for one of them to say something back then? A second longer holding his gaze? A step closer when he hesitated? A letter sent instead of hidden? She closed her eyes and leaned her head against the wall. There was no anger in her, only a tired ache. The kind that comes not from being hurt, but from finally understanding the shape of the wound. She whispered, to no one in particular, "We were always almost, weren't we?" And the house, in its quiet way, did not disagree. That evening, as twilight settled gently over Hartwell, turning the sky a shade between smoke and lavender, Elena found herself walking the path behind the houses, past the old oak with the rope swing, past the row of fence posts where kids once tied balloons for summer birthdays, past the back of Leo's shop. The air smelled like damp soil and something sweeter, maybe lilacs clinging to the last of the season. She hadn't planned to see him, but her feet carried her there, slow and quiet like memory retracing its steps. Through the open window she saw him, alone, sitting at the workbench, hunched over a bicycle frame. His hands moved out of habit, not urgency. There was no music playing tonight, no hum of a radio to fill the space. Just the sound of a wrench adjusting, metal shifting, a breath. Now and then, she didn't knock, didn't call his name. She stood there for a moment, long enough to remember the version of her who would have climbed through that window just to sit near him, saying nothing. Just to be close. Now she only watched, and what she saw wasn't a man waiting or hurting. He looked settled, maybe not content, but used to silence. And suddenly, that was the heaviest truth of all. He had learned to live without her, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in rhythm, in weather, in quiet routines and the way people do when time softens what they never got to hold. She turned before he noticed, or maybe he had and chose, like she had once, to stay still. Back at the sea, house, she didn't turn on any lights. She moved through the dusk-shadowed rooms with the calm of someone walking inside herself. In the living room, she sat on the couch, her mother's couch, her childhood couch, and reached for the photo album still resting on the shelf. She hadn't opened it in years. Inside were pages yellowing gently at the corners, filled with birthdays, Christmas mornings, blurry summer barbecues. But Leo was only in 2 photos, both from the same week. Both casual, one, where he stood behind her at a picnic, flipping burgers. The other, one she'd never noticed before, was taken from behind them, sitting on the dock, feet dangling above the lake, shoulders touching slightly, eyes lost somewhere. Ahead. She stared at that one a long time. It was a perfect picture of what they were. Close, familiar, comfortably silent, and utterly incomplete. Elena closed the album and rested her hands on top of it. The room hummed with the stillness only small towns knew after dark, and she thought, not for the first time, that it had never been a question of love. They had loved, in their own way. Quietly, steadily, in glances and laughter and bracelets, held too long. The tragedy wasn't that they hadn't loved. It was that they hadn't said it. Not when it mattered, not out loud, not in the moments when a single sentence might have rewritten everything. Her fingers tightened gently on the Me album's cover. Her throat felt full, but not with tears, just the weight of clarity. Of what it meant to be too late, not because time had run out, but because it had been left unused. There was no letter she could send now that wouldn't feel like a shadow of the one he had written years ago. No version of I know now that wouldn't arrive as an echo, but still, Still, she wanted to whisper something. To the room, to herself, to the boy she never stopped thinking of. "I was there too, Leo," she said softly. "I was right beside you. I just didn't know how to stay." And then, quieter, as if to the past itself, "I'm sorry." She let the words linger, untouched, unchased. Outside, the rain began again, soft, reluctant, the kind that sounds like someone remembering, gently, what it means to miss. 2 mornings later, Elena returned to the library, not for the deed papers, not for the zoning forms, just for the table by the window. The notebook was gone. She stood there for a moment, hands in the pockets of her coat, trying to decide whether to feel relief or disappointment. Perhaps someone had found it. Perhaps Leo had remembered and come back for it himself. Or maybe it had only been there because it needed her to read it, and once she had, it no longer belonged in the open. She turned to leave, but the young librarian, Emily, she remembered now, looked up from the desk and called out, "Ms. Walsh?" Elena paused. "I think this is yours," Emily said, holding out a small envelope. "Someone dropped it off yesterday, said you'd know what it meant." Elena walked over slowly, heart rising like something not quite ready to be felt. She took the envelope, her name, Lenny, written in block letters across the front. No return address, no seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Old, faintly yellowed, typed. Not Leo's handwriting, but it wasn't meant to be. It was from her mother. "I found this in your room the summer after you left," it began. "Didn't mean to snoop, but I knew it was something you wouldn't want thrown away." Elena sat in the nearest chair. The library faded around her again. "Never read it, I promise, but I kept it, thinking one day you'd want to remember what you almost said." Folded behind the note was a copy of the original letter Elena had written to Leo at 18. The one she thought she had lost. The one she hadn't even remembered until that day in the attic. But this copy had something different. At the bottom, in newer ink, was a short sentence in Leo's handwriting. "You didn't have to say it, Lenny. I already knew." Her breath caught. Everything inside her stilled. Not like breaking, but like recognition. As if a song she thought she'd forgotten had started playing in another room. He had seen the letter. He had read it. Maybe not in 1998. Maybe not until later. Maybe only after her mother passed it on somehow. Or maybe it had sat in a drawer just, as his had, waiting for the right hands to find it again. But he had read it. And he hadn't been angry. He hadn't been hurt. He had simply known. She didn't move for a long while, just sat there in the quiet of the library, the paper trembling faintly in her hands. Outside, the sky had turned that soft, indifferent gray again. The color Hartwell wore when it wasn't sure what it wanted to feel. Elena ran her fingers across Leo's sentence like it might change if she blinked, like she might have imagined it. "You didn't have to say it, Lenny. I already knew." It was so simple, so plain. But inside those 8 words was something larger than a confession. There was grace, forgiveness, even understanding, and something inside her, something that had long sat folded, pressed flat beneath the weight of regret, began to breathe again. She had lived all these years thinking that what they'd missed had been hers to carry, that the silence had been hers to fill, that she had walked away from something unspoken and left it too late to ever mend. But maybe it had never needed mending. Maybe it had only needed to be known. She stood up slowly, the page still warm from her hands, and walked toward the exit. Emily gave her a curious glance, but Elena only smiled, gentle and small, as if to say, yes, it was enough. Outside, the street was empty except for the sound of a dog barking far off and the wind nudging a bicycle parked against the bakery's wall. The same wind that used to tangle her hair when she and Leo rode side by side down the lake path, too young to say love, and too close to believe it wouldn't last. She reached the edge of the sidewalk and paused. There was nothing to fix now. No grand reunion waiting. No late-night knock on his door with heart in hand and a suitcase on the porch. That belonged in another story, one that might have ended differently if read aloud years earlier. But what she had now was quieter, wiser. She tucked the letter back into its envelope and pressed it against her chest for just a moment before slipping it into her coat. It didn't change the years between them. It didn't undo the silence. But it softened it. And sometimes that was all a heart needed, to know it hadn't been alone in its hoping. She exhaled, deep and slow. For the first time in years, the ache inside her didn't feel like a wound. It felt like something else. Space, maybe, where something used to be, where something tender had once lived. And in that space now, there was peace. The road out of Hartwell curved gently alongside the lake, where the trees leaned over the water like they were trying to remember their reflections. Elena drove with the window cracked just enough to let the wind touch her skin. It smelled like pine and distance. She didn't play music. The silence felt like a soft companion now, no longer a void to be filled, but a space to rest in. She passed the overlook where they used to sit on car hoods and count the lights flickering across the lake. The willow tree was still there. Thinner. Now. A little tired. Like all things that outlive the seasons they were once a part of. As the town shrank in the rearview mirror, she didn't look back. Not because she was finished with it, but because it was finished with her. And somehow, in that quiet agreement, she felt whole. She would go back to Chicago. She would return to her son, to her small apartment with the books stacked too high and the chair that creaked when she leaned too far. She would drink her morning coffee from the chipped mug Leo once teased her about, and she would live. Softly, fully. With room now for something else. For breath. For grace. For the peace of knowing she had not been forgotten. And maybe, one day, when the ache dulled further and became just a warm remembering, she would write him, not to reopen the past, but to thank it. Not to rekindle, but to recognize. Because sometimes the people we almost loved us back in ways we never knew until we were ready to understand it. And that was enough. For now. She turned off the main road and onto the highway, her hand resting gently on the suitcase beside her. Inside, the photograph lay flat between two sweaters, and beside it, the letter Leo never meant for her to find. But she had found it. And though the words would never be spoken aloud, they had reached her just the same, like the softest truth. Always there, just beneath the silence. And in that truth, she was finally able to breathe. If you felt something stir in you tonight, something unspoken, something you almost said, subscribe for more stories that know exactly how that feels. Follow us to keep traveling through love, memory, and second chances, one almost story at a time.